Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Muhammad Nazrin bin Rahim. I'm one BMMF student from FTKMP Faculty. In this video, we still gonna talk about automotive engine oil and service. But this time, I'm gonna tell you about braking system. I will show you a clip about how to service a car brake step by step with safety measure. Let's go.
Hey guys, Chris Fix here, and today I'm going to show you how to replace your brake pads and rotors on your car or your truck. And we'll be replacing the brake pads on my Mustang, which is perfect because the brake setup on this car is going to be similar, if not identical, to most other makes and models. And this video is going to be a complete guide. So if you're a beginner and you've never changed the brakes before, after watching this video, you'll know everything you need to do to be able to replace the brakes yourself. This is also a good guide for a refresher if you've done brakes before, or if you're an expert, I'm going to be including tips and tricks so anyone watching could perform a complete and thorough brake job. And the last thing I want to say for everybody who's doing this for the first time, don't be afraid to change your own brakes. I know the most nerve-wracking thing is the fear that if you do something wrong, you're not going to have brakes to stop your car. But let me tell you, the brake systems on cars are actually pretty simple and it's hard to mess up. So give it a shot. You're going to save a ton of money, you're going to learn something new, and you're going to feel proud that you're able to fix your own car. Alright, so let's begin. The tools I'll be using for this job are all common hand tools. You need a simple socket set, a breaker bar, a torque wrench, a metal wire brush, and the only specialized tool is this brake piston compressor, which is inexpensive, and you can pick this up when you pick up your brake pads and rotors. And I also want to include have a large hammer like this, which will help knock the rotors off if they're stuck, and also have a pry bar or a flathead screwdriver like this, which will help pry open the caliper. You're also going to need to get your tires off the ground, so I'll be using a jack and jack stands. And those are all the tools you're going to need. As for consumables, you're going to need some copper anti-seize, silicone paste, brake cleaner, and thread locker. And finally, you'll need some brake pads and rotors. I prefer getting ceramic brake pads. They are a little more expensive, but they have less dust, and they tend to last longer compared to the semi-metallic pads. And make sure when you get your brake pads, it includes the brake hardware, which is important for doing the complete brake job. And for rotors, I like using a regular blank rotor. While drilled and slotted rotors are nice, they will eat up your brake pads a lot quicker. So for the street, this is perfect. And that's all you need, so let's begin. There are 4 simple steps to changing your brake pads and rotors. First, you want to safely lift the car off the ground and then remove the wheel. Second, remove the brake pads, unbolt the caliper, and remove the rotor. Third, put the new rotor on, reattach the caliper, and install the new brake pads. And then fourth, put the wheel on, lower the car to the ground, and go test those brakes. So let's get started. Since we're replacing the front brakes, the first thing you're going to want to do is lift the front end off the ground. But before we do that, you're going to want to grab your wheel chalk, in this case I'm using a piece of wood, and chalk off the rear wheel so your car won't move. And before we lift the tires off the ground, we want to crack all the lug nuts so they're loose, because if you're trying to do this when the tire's off the ground, the wheel's just going to spin. If you're not sure where to jack up your car from, go check out the owner's manual. In here they give you instructions and they show you exactly where they recommend you jack the car up from. Since you replace brake pads in pairs, we're going to be doing both front brake pads. So I like jacking the car up from the middle so both tires raise up at the same time. And the best way to lift up both front tires is by jacking it up from the front cross member. This is a thick piece of metal and it supports the whole front suspension. And with the car in the air, slide your jack stand underneath the car. And I try to just stick my arms underneath the car when I move the jack stand. Don't put your whole body under the car. You don't want to be under the car until the car is securely set onto the jack stands. Now when looking for a place to put your jack stands, this right here is the floorboard. If you put it here, your jack will go right through the floor into your car. What you're looking for is you want to find a thick piece of metal frame just like this right here. And you can find the same exact spot on the other side. And after both jack stands are in place, slowly lower the car down so that the jack stands securely support the car. And just as some backup, I like to set up the jack so there's some light pressure on that cross member. And the last thing I like to do is give the car a good shake and make sure that it's stable and doesn't move. And with the car safely lifted off the ground, we could remove the lug nuts and remove the wheel. And another thing I like to do for extra safety is slide that wheel underneath the frame. That way, in worst case scenario, you have something solid there and the car won't drop all the way down. Alright, so now we have access to our brakes. So now we want to remove the old brake pads and our old rotor. And in order to do that, we need to get access to the bolts behind the caliper here. But we want to work with the car and make the job that much easier. So get in the car and turn the steering wheel so the bolts to the caliper are more accessible. And now it's that much easier to get to the bolts. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to remove the brake pads, and in order to do that, we're going to go and remove this bolt right down here, which is going to allow our caliper to pivot upwards like a clamshell, and then we can pull the pads out. Normally these bolts use a regular socket, but in this case we have a Torx bolt, so we're using a T50 Torx. And I start off with the breaker bar every time just so you could break these bolts loose easily. And then once you use your breaker bar to break the bolt loose, you could use a regular ratchet to loosen it up the rest of the way, and it'll come right out. And you can see the blue Loctite on the threads, so we'll be sure to add some when we screw this in later on. Now we could pry open our caliper, which might take a little force, and then remove our old brake pads, and they'll come right out just like that. So for this brake caliper, we just had to remove that one bolt right down here. But on other brake calipers, there's also another bolt right up here that you could remove to take this whole clamshell off. In this case, all you have to do is lift this up like that, and the caliper slides right out. And with the caliper removed, you don't want the caliper to just dangle by the brake line, because that's how you damage your brake line. So instead you want to try to find a place to put your caliper where it's out of the way and there's no pressure on the brake line. If you don't have a nice place to leave your brake caliper like that, you could also use a bungee cord or a rope or something to hang it up. Alright, next we want to remove this caliper bracket so we can pull the old brake rotor off. And to remove the caliper bracket, we want to go behind the knuckle, and you can see there's a bolt right up here and a bolt right down here holding this bracket in that we need to remove. In this case, it's a 15mm bolt, and again, start off with your breaker bar so you could easily break these loose. These are going to be the tightest bolts, so they're going to be the toughest to break loose. And again, after we're done cracking the bolts loose with our breaker bar, we could loosen them the rest of the way with our shorter ratchet. And that's one, and now we'll remove the bottom, and with no bolts holding it in, the caliper bracket slides right out. Now we're going to remove the brake rotor, and you want to make sure that the brake rotor isn't being held in by a screw. In this case, there's nothing holding it in, so you could try wiggling it off, but just as I figured, it's rusted to the hub. So to remove the rotor, we're going to be using a large hammer. And you want to use a pretty good amount of force and hit the outside edge of the rotor, spinning the rotor as you go, until it breaks loose. Just like that. And if you take a look at the back of the rotor, you can see it's all rusty in here, which just rust welds itself right to the hub. Now with our old rotor off, we want this surface right here to be smooth and relatively rust-free. It doesn't have to be perfect, but we want a good flat surface. So grab your metal wire brush or sandpaper and start removing the rust from the hub surface. It's also a good idea to use eye protection and a dust mask while you're doing this. You want to have a smooth surface for your new brake rotor so it can mount flush against the hub. And after we sand the whole surface, we want to grab a bucket, grab our brake cleaner, and spray it down. And since we're cleaning things up, now's a good time to clean up our caliper bracket. Awesome. With everything sanded down, we could add our new brakes. But you guys know how I like to go over the top with my cars. So I cleaned up the suspension a little bit. So I just removed all the grease, I sanded it down, used a little bit of primer, and then used black spray paint to get this looking real nice. And you guys definitely don't have to spray paint your whole suspension, but you want to just make sure that your hub surface is completely smooth so that we could install our new brake rotor. And before you go and install your brake rotor, one thing that they do with brake rotors is they put this oily film on here so that the brake rotors won't rust when they're all packaged inside the box. So what you do is you get a little bit of brake clean and just spray down the entire surface of the rotor, and then wipe it down with a paper towel, and you can see all the oils that are getting removed from that rotor surface. And don't forget to do the other side as well. Wipe it clean, and again, look at all the oils we removed. Good, now we can install our rotor. And you'll see that the rotor tends to want to fall off. So a little trick to hold it in place is to use a lug nut and just thread it all the way on so it prevents the rotor from moving while you install the rest of the brakes. With the rotor securely in place, now we can install our caliper bracket, which is held in with these two bolts. And we want to add some medium strength thread locker to prevent vibrations from loosening up the bolts as we drive. Now we could take a bolt and align our caliper bracket and tighten the bolt by hand. And we'll do the same thing with the second bolt and hand tighten that all the way down. Good. Now grab your torque wrench, and on this car, the caliper bracket bolts get torqued down to 90 pound-feet. That's one, and that's the other. With our caliper bracket in place, now we want to grab our caliper, and we need to compress this piston all the way back into the caliper, so our new thick brake pads will fit in here. And a quick tip is, before you go and compress this piston into the caliper, we want to remove all the acidic brake dust and all the dirt and grime here, because we don't want that stuff to find its way into the caliper and contaminate the brake fluid and damage the seals. Now you don't want to spray the brake clean directly onto here because there's a rubber seal right back here and brake clean will dry out that seal. So instead just spray it onto a towel and clean off that piston. And that simple trick will prolong the life of your caliper. Now we could compress the piston. And to compress the piston, just get one of the old brake pads, put it up against the piston, and then get your brake piston compressor tool, slide it in there, and start turning it. And you can watch the brake piston compress right back into the caliper. This should feel nice and smooth, it shouldn't be difficult to do, and once it starts getting difficult to turn, that means you bottomed out here, so loosen it up and remove the tool and brake pad. Now there are some pistons that are solid and have a cross in them, and these pistons need to be turned to compress, and they make an inexpensive tool for that. This is most common on the rear brakes, but I just wanted to show you in case you encounter this. So with our piston compressed, now's a good time to add our new brake hardware. For this caliper, we only have one brake clip that goes right there, so I'm just going to use a screwdriver and pop this out. And the old one was oriented like that, so we'll install our new one in the exact same orientation. Good. And with the piston compressed, our brake clip in, and our caliper bracket on, we're ready to install our brake pads. But before we do that, we need to lubricate the brake system. And to do that, we're going to be using a copper-based anti-seize, not the typical silver graphite-based anti-seize. So the first area of lubrication is right here at the brake caliper bracket. Right where the brake pad and guide meets up here and down here, we want to add some anti-seize. So be careful, just add a little bit right down here and right up here. And it makes sense to have some type of lubrication here so you don't have metal to metal contact with no lubricant, because this does have to slide back and forth as the brakes get used. And then on the other side of the caliper, you have the identical spots where the brake pads sit in that you also want to lubricate. It's also important to lubricate the brake hardware, so just get a little copper anti-seize and lubricate the top of the brake hardware. And the last place to add a thin layer of anti-seize is on the back of the brake pad, which helps prevent squeaks. And that's everything you need to lubricate. And right now your hands are going to be covered in anti-seize, so it's important that you clean them off or get new gloves, because you don't want to get the anti-seize on the brake pad surface or the rotor, which could cause your brakes to fail. Alright, so let's install our brake pads. And if you guys were wondering what these stripes were on the brake pads, that's actually burnishing compound to help break the brake pads in. And it's really this easy. The brake pads just slide right in just like that. They won't fit in properly if you put them in backwards, and that's what I mean before where I was saying it's really easy to install brakes and it's really hard to mess this up. Now the caliper slides on something called caliper guide pins, which is this right here. You want this to be smooth, rust-free, and lubricated really well so the caliper could move freely. So clean it up with some brake clean, and now you're going to want to add some silicone paste right to that caliper guide pin. Don't use anti-seize and don't use a petroleum-based lubricant because those products will degrade the rubber on the caliper. Silicone's the proper lubricant to use for the guide pins. And this is how one setup for the guide pins looks. In other cars, like this Honda, the guide pins are built into the caliper, which are just like bolts that you slide out, clean off, lubricate, and then push back in. You want to make sure that the guide pins move freely. In this case, the caliper slides over the guide pin, and then you close the caliper over the brake pads like so. And now we're going to install our bolt, but if you remember, we saw some blue Loctite on the end here, so I'm going to add a little bit of blue Loctite on the end and tighten our bolt up. Now this bolt gets torqued down to 25 pound-feet of torque. Then we can turn the steering wheel straight so we can more easily put the wheel back on. And don't forget to remove that lug nut you had on there to hold the rotor in place. Then you can put the wheel on your car and hand tighten all your lug nuts. And we are almost done. Now go do your brakes on the other side, and then after you finish the other side, remove the jack stands and slowly lower the car so the tires are just touching the ground so they won't spin when you go to torque them. Now you want to torque down your lug nuts in a star pattern so the wheel tightens evenly. Most wheels are torqued between 80 and 100 pound-feet, and in this case I'm torquing them to 100. With the wheels torqued, let the full weight of the car on the wheels and remove the jack. And that's all there is to replacing your brake pads and rotors. Hey guys, Chris Fix here. Today I'm going to show you how to flush your brake fluid. I'm putting brand new calipers on my truck because the old ones are going bad, they're leaking, and I don't want to flush the old brake fluid into the brand new calipers. So I'm going to flush the whole system with .3 brake fluid before I change out the brake calipers. The other thing is this fluid hasn't been flushed for probably since the truck was brand new. And this is a 2001 Mazda B3000 Ford Ranger, so in reality, it should really be flushed anyway. Brake fluid should be flushed every 2 to 3 years because it's hygroscopic, meaning it likes to absorb water. The problem with water in the brake fluid is when water gets in here, water has a really low boiling point compared to brake fluid. Brake fluid, the boiling point could be 400 degrees, but water boiling point is 212 degrees Fahrenheit, so it's not very high. And the brakes get hot, and they could easily exceed 200 degrees Fahrenheit. So if that happens and you have a lot of water in your brake fluid, the water will vaporize, it'll evaporate, it'll boil, creating a void. When you press on the brake, that void is compressible, so it'll feel like you don't have any brakes, which is bad. Not only will it feel like you don't have any brakes, you won't have any brakes. I'll explain more about brake fluid and how water gets in and all that stuff in another video. Some people say, oh, you can use .4 instead of .3. I'll explain all that in another video. It goes in depth. If you want to see that video, the link will be in the description below. But for this video, we're focusing on how to bleed the brakes. Now there are two methods to use to bleed the brakes. The first method is the two-person method. This is the most common method. You need yourself and a buddy. The buddy presses on the brakes, you open the bleeder valve, close the bleeder valve, and that's the most common way to do it. And I'll also show you the one-person method so you can do the job yourself. So to do this job, you need an open-ended wrench, check your owner's manual for the brake fluid your car uses, and if you want to use the one-person method, you need some type of small bottle like this, and a hose that fits over the bleeder valve. I'll put a link in the description to a quick video on how to make a one-person bleeder. It's really fast and easy to do. The other thing that is optional but is really helpful is if you have a turkey baster, because the first thing we're going to do is remove as much brake fluid as we can out of the master cylinder. You want to make sure you clean your master cylinder with a paper towel before you open up the cap. Make sure the cap is cleaned off too. You don't want any contaminants getting in. With that cleaned off, we'll open it up, set the cap aside. Now we have our can here. I'm going to suck out as much fluid as I can and put it right in here. The reason why you want to do this first is because when you're flushing your brakes, the brake fluid is coming from the reservoir, then we're pulling new clean fluid through the brake lines instead of the old dirty fluid. And speaking of old dirty fluid, look how dirty this is. New brake fluid is going to be clear, and that's practically black. If you spill any brake fluid, you want to immediately clean it up. Brake fluid is very caustic, it'll eat through paint, it'll cause corrosion on metal. You really don't want brake fluid touching anything. Okay. So you don't want to go too low on the master cylinder because you don't want to get air in through the master cylinder. So this is a pretty good amount taken out of the master cylinder. You can see there's still fluid in the master cylinder to prevent it from running dry so we don't get air into the system. Now I have my new brake fluid. Never buy this in bulk and always use it right away. This doesn't really store on the shelf very well. I'm going to fill the master cylinder with the new fluid. I'm going to overfill it because when I bleed the brakes, we're going to lose a lot of fluid as it bleeds out of each brake. Make sure you always cap this right away. Try to get a seal on this. And then we'll cap this as well. Now I poured that fluid nice and smoothly, so hopefully the new fluid stays near the top and the old fluid stays near the bottom. The good thing about emptying your master cylinder first is now you have some brake fluid that you could use to prevent air bubbles from getting in. So just put your tube on here, screw that in, and make sure that tube goes all the way down to the bottom. So now any air bubbles that come out will get forced into the air up here, and any sucking back will be sucking back brake fluid. I know it's old brake fluid, but it's going to get pushed out anyway, so it's not a big deal. When you're doing this, I like to follow the rule that you're supposed to do the furthest wheel from the master cylinder first, and then go in order. So the second furthest, third furthest, and fourth furthest. So in this case, it's going to go passenger side rear, driver's side rear, passenger side front, driver's side front. So we're going to start at the passenger side rear. That's the furthest away. The ABS system sometimes makes it weird because if the ABS system's in the rear, then your furthest brake lines sometimes are the front ones. But in general, start from the rear, move to the front. The bleeder valve on drum brakes is located usually at the top. You look for the brake line that comes in, and then it's this little valve right here. And you can use a wrench over the bleeder valve to open and close it. So this is the passenger rear. The first method I'm going to show you is the two-person method. With the two-person method, all you need is a wrench and another person. One person presses on the brake, and the other one opens and closes the bleeder valve. To bleed the brakes, you really don't need to remove the wheels. I'm just doing it so I could easily show you guys and get in there and have good camera angles. But if you really want to, you could keep the wheels on. So with the two-person method, move the wrench counterclockwise to open the bleeder valve. Press the brakes! Then I'm going to close it. Okay! So I'm just telling the person to press the brakes, and they're going to press down, and I'm going to open this. Press the brakes! Then I'm going to close it. Okay. And when I say okay, they can let go. So we're at the master cylinder, and you can see the brake fluid went down, but not a lot. It's only a little below the max. So let's continue flushing the brakes. Make sure you check the master cylinder fluid about every 10 times you press the brake, because you don't want it to run dry. So now I'm going to add more brake fluid since we've been pressing them for a little bit now. And while adding this fluid, we can see that there's no more old brake fluid left in the master cylinder. Press the brakes. Okay, press the brakes. Okay. As you can see, this brake fluid is as clear as the new brake fluid we put in, so that means this brake line is flushed. Check out the difference between the brake fluid before we did the flush. Press the brakes. So now that we're done with this brake line, I won't tell the other person okay until I tighten the bleeder valve all the way and it's closed. After it's closed, they can let their foot off the brake. You should also have them check to make sure the brake pedal is firm, which indicates you have no air in the system. Okay. You can see this fluid is super clear, and I got a bunch of fluid out. Let's move on to the next one. Since we're going to bleed a new brake, let's add some more fluid. Close that up. Now let's go to the driver's side rear brake, and I'll show you how to use the one-person method. For the one-person method, you'll be doing this on your own, so you want to prevent air from getting in while you're pressing the brake. To do that, we use our bottle system here. We want to fill it up with some brake fluid, and then have the hose beneath that brake fluid. So if it sucks anything up, it's sucking up brake fluid, not air. We want this hose to go above our bleeder valve. You can see our bleeder valve is here. Just slide that over. Make sure that zip tie is really tight around that nipple. Here's where the brake cylinder is with the bleeder valve, and you can see it goes up. Because air travels upwards through the liquid, it won't get sucked back down. It'll be up there and forced out. So now I'm just going to crack this open a little bit more. There you go. You can see brake fluid and air just came out. So now I'm going to go and press the brakes. As I press the brakes, watch the brake fluid force the air out of the tube. You can see the bottle of brake fluid bubbling, yet no air flows back into the brake cylinder. I'm just pressing the brakes to the floor smoothly, and then letting off the brakes, and then repeating. I'll fast forward this and you'll notice how the brake fluid goes from dark to clear, indicating the fluid has been flushed. Also notice it doesn't take as long as the first brake. This is because the one-person method is faster, and because with the first brake, you flushed all the remaining old fluid out of the master cylinder. So now we're just flushing the old fluid out of the brake line only. So I just came out to check to make sure there's no bubbles in the clear tube. It's actually getting a lot clearer. You can see that's what it was before. This is after. So this is working great by myself. Now I'm going to go and check the master cylinder. Okay, the master cylinder is low. It's at this line down here. So I'm going to add more fluid. We've used almost half of this, which means that we're almost halfway done. This is 32 ounces, almost 1 liter, and that'll be just enough to get this brake flush done. Let's finish up on the driver's side rear and move to the passenger side front brakes. You can see that there are no air bubbles in the brake fluid by the bleeder valve, which means that you can tighten it up and you won't have to worry about any air in your brake system. Before we move on, the one-person bleeder is pretty much full, so I'm going to empty it a little more than halfway. So now we're going to the passenger side front brake. On this car, the front brakes are disc brakes. It's going to be bled the same exact way. Here's the bleeder valve. It's at the top. You just loosen it. Same exact thing. So it doesn't matter if you have drum brakes or if you have disc brakes. The bleeding process is the same. So now I just bled this. You don't need to see it. It's off camera. I'm going to do the driver's side, and you'll see that one just so you can see what it's like to do disc brakes, even though it's the same. But you don't need to see this. So I finished the passenger front disc brakes. Let's move to the driver front for the last brake bleeding. So we're doing the same process as we've been doing. Get your clear hose, slide it on there just like that, and then slide down your zip tie so it looks exactly like that. The brake line still goes above the bleeder valve to let air out. So I'm going to just crack this open. Now I'm going to go press on the brakes. So if nothing is coming out, like in this situation, what I'm going to do is I'm going to unscrew this the whole way. Be prepared because brake fluid's probably going to come out. Put a bucket underneath just in case we get a lot of brake fluid. The reason why brake fluid isn't coming out of here is because it's clogged, so we're going to unclog it. So now's a good time to get a tool that has a pick on the end or a toothpick or something ready. Brake fluid's going to start coming out, and you can see there's all rust and contaminants in here. The actual bleeder valve has a hole in it, and that hole's right there. There you go. And you can see that thing was rusted shut. In reality, you should replace your bleeder valve like this if it's like this, but I'm replacing the whole caliper. I'm just trying to bleed all the contaminated fluid out first. So this isn't a big deal, but if I were you and this is the situation and you weren't replacing the brake calipers, I would totally get a new bleeder valve, because this could just rust up again. You're getting your brake fluid contaminated, and it's just going to cause you problems. And eventually, if this is rusting, it's going to just snap on you. And ask me how I know about that. We got the hole working again, got all that rust out. Let's see if it'll work now. All we're going to do is just close this up, and get our clear plastic hose back on this, because this time, hopefully this will work. Now I'm going to go check by pressing on the brake. Oh man, look at all that rust. That is disgusting brake fluid. Thank God we're doing this. That is all rusty brake fluid. So we're right here. We want to check our master cylinder, and you can see it's low, so we want to fill it up. Brake fluid in there looks really clear compared to before, and that is great. Just gonna bleed this out a little bit more and then call it a day. Fluid is running pretty clear right now. That's good. So now I'm gonna tighten this. Good. The brake pedal is nice and hard. I'm gonna remove this. So there's our finished product. You got about 1.5 of these, which is exactly a liter or 32 ounces. There's gonna be just enough to fill this back up with brand new fluid. So let's do that now. And we want to fill this to the correct level now, because we're done. Good. That's the correct level, right to the max line. We want to make sure the cap is sealed on nice and tight. And we have brake fluid that is good for 2 to 3 years. So that's how you flush your own brake fluid. Hopefully this video was helpful. If it was, give it a thumbs up.